Greetings, Starfighters. Welcome to Shameless Cashgrab. This is hopefully the first of 4 movies that you will get in this calendar month. I'm calling it Junedead because of the UN in June and the UN in Undead. I think it works. Part of how we're hoping to do that, in order to have time to get it all out, is to film all the video segments for the next 4 episodes, including this one, just all filmed at once. So, get used to this shirt. Eagle-eyed viewers might recognize this as the shirt that I was wearing in the very first episode, first proper episode of this show when I covered Pulse back in season 1. Anyway, for today's movie, we've got The Vampire Bat from 1933. 1933, that would make this the second oldest movie I have covered on this show thus far, the oldest, of course, being Nosferatu. So, let's see how it turns out.
Okie dokie, The Vampire Bat, 1933. Let's get into this. Plot summary, courtesy of Letterboxd. When the villagers of Kleinschloss start dying of blood loss... I'm sorry, I've had this... I heard the script like a week ago, and I only just noticed that rhyme. God damn. I'm not even tired. Why is this making me laugh so much? I'm sorry. The town fathers suspect a resurgence of vampirism. While Police Inspector Karl remains skeptical, scientist Dr. von Niemann cares for the vampire's victims one by one, and suspicion falls on simple-minded Herman Gleib because of his fondness for bats. A bloodthirsty mob hounds Gleib to his death, but the vampire attacks don't stop. So, whatever happened to Fay Wray? She's in this movie. Look, how many chances to make a Rocky Horror reference do you think I'm going to get on this show? But, speaking of music, if I can sum up the theme music that opens this movie in one word, that word would be generic. I swear it is exactly the same as so many other mid-30s to about, say, early 50s sci-fi horror movies I've seen over the years, either on their own or on MST3K. But that aside, the movie jumps right into the plot with the meeting of the aforementioned town fathers, or town bigwigs, or the Council of Old White Men, whatever you want to call it, discussing the 6th in a series of murders, oh god, my poor DS is going to have to work overtime on this one, that most of them blame on vampires, except for the designated skeptic of the film, the aforementioned Inspector Karl. He's being perfectly rational, of course, so this being a horror movie, he'll probably be proven wrong very soon. Not long after that, we meet the scientist/doctor, von Niemann, and the developmentally disabled guy from the plot summary, Herman Gleib. I'll give the movie this much, it doesn't make the mentally ill the butt of any jokes. In fact, as the summary suggests, his arc is actually quite sad, as he ends up the victim of blind panic and prejudice. There are movies made today that aren't quite so sympathetic to the neurodivergent. It's not exactly the best portrayal either, this is still the 1930s, but it is better than what you would usually get in this era. The only real bad thing we see him doing is trying to steal an apple. But that doesn't go so well, as he accidentally cuts himself while he's slicing it. But before all that happens, I just want to give a shout out to the character of Aunt Gussie, played by an actress named Maud Ebern. I'm going to go with Maud Ebern and hope that I'm pronouncing that right. Anyway, her scenes are pretty consistently funny. She has a very dry wit, and while she's almost certainly a hypochondriac, there's a hint that she's trying to flirt with Dr. von Niemann as well, during her numerous visits to him. As for who the vampire really was, it was the doctor all along, aided by his assistant, who we only see a little of throughout the movie. And it looks like he might be a real vampire, as he directs the assistant from a distance, apparently through telepathy, not unlike the Dracula Renfield link. This was actually pretty well foreshadowed early on, but I'll admit that at first I thought it was a misdirect. When they first showed him going to a locked room when no one was around, I figured it would be related to his research into how the victims died, like the Letterboxd summary said. Though this is not to say he isn't doing research at all. See, while he displays at least one of the established powers of vampires that most vampire lore uses on screen, he doesn't actually bite his victims. He uses medical equipment to drain them. He seems to be growing something in his lab, though we never quite find out what it is. just that he seems to think that creating it was worth having killed 7 people to grow it to about the size of a grapefruit. A spongy grapefruit that looks like it's breathing. Ew. Though I guess if he's not using any of that blood himself, for himself, on himself, no, if he's not drinking the blood, then I guess he still doesn't really count as a vampire. But, even though, despite that, I'm going to allow it, because vampire mythos is actually central to the plot, even if the killer is not actually a vampire. There is much more of an effort to connect this story to vampire lore than there was in something like Atom Age Vampire, which had very little effort, or for Primeval, which had no fucking effort whatsoever, so why the hell is it even in this set? Back to the movie, I like how the Doctor ultimately ends up giving himself away. In a lesser movie, it would have been something incredibly stupid, but here he tries to frame Herman, but in the process he underestimates how long it would take for the mob to find him. Thus, he was unaware that Herman had already died from a fall while running away, at the time the next victim was being killed. A lot of writers in TV and film, sometimes even the good ones, forget that a character doesn't need to be stupid to make a mistake. Not that that alone is enough to expose him, of course, but it is the beginning of the end, for Dr. von Niemann. Another misstep occurs when he fails to account for the possibility that Fay Wray's character, Ruth, who plays a slightly more important role in the movie than one might think, given that I haven't really talked about her much, would still be awake. He failed to take into account that she would still be awake. At the hour, he sends his assistant to nab Carl. Whoopsie-doodle. Not that it works. Carl, who managed to hide his suspicions of the Doctor pretty well, managed to overpower the assistant. This happens off-screen, but unlike the other movies in this set where that was actually something of a negative, you may remember I complained a lot about all the off-screen action going on in Atom Age Vampire. In this movie it works, because it sets up a pretty cool reveal. When the Doctor thinks he's taking the tarp off of the unconscious inspector, only to see his unconscious assistant instead. Nice. Turns out Carl managed to piece together that Dr. von Niemann was up to something. Like I mentioned earlier, mentioned him being suspicious, so he faked being asleep to set a trap. Very clever. Though the sequence loses a few points with the assistant's face turn. Yeah, see, it was implied earlier that the assistant wasn't 100% on board with the kidnapping and draining people of their blood, so it's not the turn itself that's the issue, but rather how quick it happens. He pretty much seems to be on the side of the good guys the second he regains consciousness. That's a little bit rushed, in my opinion. Although I suppose, it's probably wasn't on purpose, but you could make the argument that it was whatever Carl did to knock him out that kind of broke the hypnotic suggestion. It wasn't complete control because the assistant would, hesitate before grabbing a victim, and he was clearly not happy to be doing it, but okay, it's an issue, but it doesn't kill the movie for me. Anyway, as Carl leads Ruth to safety, the assistant appears to kill the Doctor, then himself, though we don't see this, we just hear it. That, unfortunately, is a bad example of off-screen action. The Doctor's body apparently fell on the tank, so whatever he was growing is presumably dead too. If it was ever really that alive to begin with. So, yeah, on the whole, this one is a mix on the vampire connection. The mental control, or rather suggestion to be more accurate, is certainly a classic vampire ability, as does his seeming ability to see through his assistant's eyes from a fair amount of distance. And the Doctor actually does go to great lengths to make sure the village thinks it's a vampire behind all the killings. But he doesn't bite anyone, nor does he drink the blood, as I mentioned earlier. However, he does use the blood to create life of some kind, which is sort of like how vampires sire fledglings in these kinds of stories, occasionally. It's always different. Sometimes it's making the vampire making the victim drink their blood. Sometimes it works like a virus. There's any number of ways to do this. But I really wonder why they didn't tell us what he was working on. Oh, okay. As I was writing this part of the script, the video file on the DVD ended, and, yeah, it looks like the Mill Creek cut of the film is missing over 3 minutes. Amazing. I mean, this is already a short-ass movie to begin with. Why would forget it. Movie's over now. Random thoughts I had while watching the movie. I could be wrong, and honestly I'm too lazy to go look it up, but I think that at 64 minutes, this is the shortest movie I've covered on this show up to this point. Some of the dialogue gets a little purple prosy, but despite that, I rather liked the flirtation scenes between Carl and Ruth. The two had great chemistry, definitely one of the high points of the film. Speaking of Ruth, who, as I mentioned before, was played by Fay Wray, it's hilarious to me that throughout the entire movie, she doesn't scream. I'm thinking this was done on purpose. You know, kind of like how on Star Trek, through the whole time that Walter Koenig played him, Chekhov never successfully fired a phaser. Get it? Because Chekhov's gun? Final verdict. Despite being made 7 years earlier than The Devil Bat and not having Bela Lugosi in it, this movie actually manages to be on par or maybe even better than that film in pretty much every way I can think of. My complaints with it are minor, and can probably be chalked up to the filmmaker seemingly not being allowed to give the movie a longer runtime. I would like to see those missing 3 minutes to be sure, but even without those, I can say I actually kind of liked this one. So, tune in next time on Shameless Cash Grab when I will be getting to the one, the only, the man, the myth, the legend, Vincent Price in The Last Man on Earth.